So I'm pleased to introduce the second session, which is called Comparative Imaginations of Self-Determination. And our first paper is delivered by two speakers from Trinity College, Gabriela, Lojewska, and McEvansoneya, who are taking on the subject of Polish art in Dublin in peace and in war. Gabriela is a senior sophister reading History of Art and Architecture and Spanish Art at Trinity College, Dublin. Gabriela is currently researching a dissertation on the architecture of the ideal Renaissance town of Zamość in Poland. She's the co-author of Propaganda and Polishness in Art by Cultural Diplomacy in Ireland in 1937, which is forthcoming in History Ireland. McEvansoneya, who in fact was a lecturer of mine back in the 90s, has been a lecturer in the History of Art department at Trinity College since 1991. A current research project is on exhibitions of continental prints in Ireland from the 1920s to the 50s. Recent and forthcoming publications include Estella Solomon's and the Irish contribution to the Artists' Refugee Committee, forthcoming in the British Art Journal, a School of Irish Letters, Samuel Ferguson's Fountain series, the Irish Studies Review, and the interest in Murillo in Ireland in Isabel Kent, collecting Murillo in Britain and Ireland, Madrid, 2020. Welcome, both of you. And Gabriela is going to speak first.
Thank you very much. I feel really honored to speak here. Now, Polish art in Dublin in peace and war. The Polish Second Republic, which was founded in 1918, was the revival and the embodiment of Polish national fortunes, because since the end of the 18th century, Poland has been partitioned and the Polish language and culture repressed. Despite the partition, over the course of the 19th century, there was a progressive consolidation of Polish cultural identity. In late 19th century, Ireland and Poland alike, cultural nationalism thrived, while each remained under external political control. After 1819, cultural or soft diplomacy became all the more common a practice, especially by newly independent countries such as Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. Against the backdrop of deteriorating international relations in Europe in the mid and late 1930s, cultural diplomacy remained a way of making connections, gaining influence, developing commerce, and promoting tourism. It could precede or support or be the public face of formal diplomatic relations. A strategy was adopted to project self-determination and portray Poland as a modern state and an ancient nation with a distinctive culture. Oh God. Perfect. This led to a mounting of series of exhibitions that were sent to old and powerful European states such as Britain, France, and Germany, as well as newly emerging states, Baltic, Balkan, and Nordic countries, but also as far as USA and Japan. These were selected and overseen by Towarzystwo Szerzenia Sztuki Polskiej wśród Obcych, TSPO, the Society for the Dissemination of Polish Art Abroad that was set up for the purpose in 1925. The exhibitions included representative examples of historic and contemporary Polish art, especially original prints and contemporary crafts that collectively showed a distinct national style. Exhibitions were the prime means of communicating about Polish art, history, and aspirations. Prints and textiles were much more convenient and much less vulnerable to pack and ship than paintings. Therefore, there were, oh, did it work? Don't think it worked. Oh. Therefore, they were the main sole materials in many of the numerous TSPO exhibitions in the 1920s and 30s, such as that which came to Dublin in 1937. Here, we shall consider four events: the exhibition in 1937 of prints and kilns, the abortive plans for the exhibition by the Warsaw-centered group Block in 1939, and the Polish works included in the 1944 Loan exhibition of modern continental paintings. But we start with an individual, Stefan Lojewski, and the exhibition of his prints held at Waddington Gallery in Dublin in 1935. Like the other three events, this one also took place with the essential participation of Wacław Tadeusz Dobrzyński, the Polish diplomatic representative of Ireland. He is the connection between each of these events. Although Ireland had no close links with Poland, the operations of the 1930s of the Irish-Polish Friendship Circle remain unclear, and had no diplomatic presence there, and so could not reciprocate. Through his cultural enterprise, Dobrzyński built relationships where otherwise none may have existed. In addition to his diplomatic skills, Dobrzyński, who had been in post since 1929, was highly cultured and well connected with an art world in Ireland. His role in Ireland has been sometimes touched on, but it's nowhere adequately recognized. As for Mrożewski, he was resident in London between 1935 to 1937, following several peripatetic years on the continent during which he exhibited and built his artistic reputation. Internationally, in London, he exhibited at Helen Lesro's Beaux-Arts Gallery and worked for Time and Tide magazine and private press publishers such as Greynog and Nonsuch. It was his work for Time and Tide that provided him with some of the main prints for his Dublin exhibition in November 1935. The exhibition was brief in duration and modest in scope. 38 prints were shown, comprising portraits along with book illustrations, such as a series of 12 for an edition of Eschenbach's Parsifal. Nonetheless, it marked a démarche. This event had official support and was promoted at the time by Dobrzyński as the first exhibition of Polish art in Ireland, as much as the first exhibition of Mrożewski in Ireland. Pioneering through Mrożewski's one-man show was the exhibition of Polish art. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Carrying on, pioneering though Mrożewski's one-man show was, the exhibition of Polish art that took place in Dublin in 1937 was a more significant event. First, it was a more distinct episode in the Polish cultural diplomacy campaign, and second, it was unprecedented in Ireland as a freestanding event devoted to the arts of Poland. TSPO stated that it pursued propaganda of Polishness by art in foreign exhibitions. Therefore, the exhibition was brought to Dublin with the involvement of the Polish Consul General, Dobrzyński, who is very much the hero of the piece. Dobrzyński arranged that an exhibition of Polish art and design, which had recently been shown at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, would come to Dublin at the beginning of 1937. This was an opportunity to expand significantly on what had been achieved by testing the water with Mrożewski in 1935. The exhibition was intended to bring Polish art and design to public and critical exposure, and to show that the arts in general were fostered by and represented the new Polish state. That is to say, consciousness raising. At the closure of the London showing, TSPO donated a selection of prints to the Victoria and Albert Museum. If it was hoped that something similar would be done in Dublin, then the hope was in vain. The opening of the exhibition, as my slide here indicates, was something of a social event, and there was a good turnout of artistic, diplomatic, legal, literary and political Dublin. Eamon de Valera himself was invited, but diplomatically could not attend. Informal personal contact on the margins of cultural events was held to be one of the most effective means of promoting state aims, and that's a point that's very frequently made by the theorists of cultural diplomacy. Artistic forms of cultural expression in the new Polish state were held to be authentic as they were engendered and legitimized by inheritance from the national past. Traditionalism of this sort was a counterweight to the adoption by many Polish artists, principally painters, of modern French or German artistic forms. The Dublin exhibition consisted of a small but prominently displayed selection of copies of old prints, like the one on the left here, that had been rediscovered as recently as 1921, the originals of which dated mainly from the 18th century and therefore had pre-partition origins. As examples of folk woodcuts, their awkward but expressive form and primitive techniques were seen as evidence of their authenticity. They were the bedrock of Polish printmaking traditions. The second part of the 1937 event was a large selection of modern prints in various techniques, including work by leading Polish artists. The third part consisted of a number of kilims, or hand-woven fabrics, that incorporated modern versions of traditional designs. Kilims were an important craft product and were promoted as a distinct national form. So here we see some examples of the prints shown in 1937, a few examples to indicate the range of subject matter, the variety of styles, and the different media exhibited. The exhibition overall was said to have proved to be extremely popular, though I can't put a number on the attendance level. One of the founders of TSPO, the promotional organisation, was Władysław Skoczajlas, then the leading Polish printmaker, indeed the leading Polish printmaker of the 20s and 30s, and also the main teacher of the following generation. Effectively, then he was the founder of a new school of Polish woodcut. So we're looking at his example on the top left. Unsurprisingly, given his influence and high status, there were as many as 14 works by Skoczajlas, chief among them being this example, the Górale. The Górales, an ethnic group of the Tatras of southern Poland, play a role in the Polish imagination not unlike that of the West and the islands of the Atlantic seaboard play in the Irish imagination. The Górales and their region came to exemplify an authentic type of Polishness in which a renewed interest arose during the era of the Young Poland movement of the 1890s and early 1900s, which echoed and coincided with the Irish revival. Both were manifestations of the forces of cultural nationalism that ran in parallel with political independence movements. This particular print, the Górale, combines composition and technique to striking effect as it examines the venerable figure of a kind of ethnographic subject. The figure is shown in traditional dress and is symbolically located between a church and a wayside shrine, stressing the secular and religious traditions. The other examples include Mother by Kulusewicz, which uses a very direct type of composition and a very stark sort of graphic style. A much more traditional subject by Ostoja Krostowski of the fleeing to Egypt, traditional religious subject treated in a modern form with no loss of reverence. And at the bottom left, we can see Konarska's colour woodcut of a tourist-friendly and very fashionable sporting subject of the sort for which she won a silver medal at the Art Olympics in Los Angeles in 1932. Other subjects on this occasion included Polish landscapes, views of towns and cities, as well as scenes of agriculture and cottage industry. Among the exhibits then were some, such as Skoczajlas's Górale, that are now considered to be works of national importance, as well as masterpieces of their medium. In some, the exhibition portrayed Polishness, that is, Polish national identity, as Catholic, traditionalist but inventive, coherent but varied, and distinct but not mannered. Such images may have resonated in the Ireland of the 1930s, where the process of defining or redefining post-independence culture was ongoing. Against the backdrop of the descent into war at the end of the 30s, an exhibition of the Warsaw Group block was held in May to June 1939 in the New Burlington Gallery in London. It was the single most important exhibition of Polish art in interwar England, and very nearly was too in Ireland. Between the London exhibition and the outbreak of war, it was proposed, again by Dobrzyński, to bring this block exhibition to Dublin. Dobrzyński turned to the Municipal Gallery of Modern Art, the Hugh Lane Gallery, as his venue. The London Embassy, as this letter shows, could provide no funding and recommended the plan be dropped. But Dublin Corporation, in an unexpected turn of events, approved expenditure of approximately £200 in connection with this event. The plans continued to be made into August for an exhibition to open in or after October 1939, but of course the events of September 1939 rather interfered with that. So it can be assumed that the outbreak of war put paid to this idea, but the exhibition itself acquired a new lease of life as a result and circulated as a more overtly propaganda exercise in Britain and elsewhere. So here are some of the examples of the works that Dublin missed on this occasion. The block group's paintings, prints and some sculpture, represented by this snapshot here, became marooned in England following the outbreak of war with the Nazi invasion of Poland in September of 1939. They were redeployed as overt cultural propaganda, and various groups of works were toured again in Britain, sometimes as a selling exhibition, and later in Canada. The block exhibition may in part be seen as a reciprocation for the exhibition in January 1939 of contemporary British art that was sent by the British Council to Warsaw and Krakow and indeed elsewhere. And that particular exhibition included these two examples that were borrowed from the Municipal Gallery, that is the Hugh Lane Gallery, as representative works of, in inverted commas, the British school that was suitable for exhibition in Poland and in Scandinavia as well. Thus, British art was partly represented in Poland by loans from Ireland, and despite the misgivings of the Municipal Gallery, which referred to ominously the present state of Europe, somewhat reluctant to lend these examples. It was with the 1944 loan exhibition of modern continental paintings that Dobrzyński's next opportunity came. By then, he was the minister of the Polish government in exile in London. This event was organised by the Friends of the National Collections of Ireland. The loans were obtained mainly from public and private owners in Ireland, thereby proving the artistic resources available in the country. These included works by 19th century pioneers like Cézanne, Degas and Manet, along with contemporaries like Chagall, Marie Auet and Picasso. The list of lenders alone is highly informative, and it is intriguing for us to see that diplomatic sources, both Czech and Polish, also contributed. As for the Czechs, Karel Koskol, who was the representative in Dublin of the Czech government in exile, was as well established in Irish cultural circles as Dobrzyński. In Koskol's case, this was not least through his leadership of the Koskol Quartet, which gave musical performances in public and on the radio, in which he was joined as first violin by Maud Aitken, who we heard about just now, the wife of the then Minister for Defensive Measures. The evidence of the exhibition is that both Dobrzyński and Koskol had works of art available to them from their respective governments in exile in London, which had been drawn on already for many earlier exhibitions in England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Canada and elsewhere as more overt propaganda exercises. Here are some examples of the works. These exhibitions use the familiar guise of cultural diplomacy for outright propaganda purposes, but intriguingly for our perspective, we find, for example, Hendrik Gottlieb's painting in a Cornish lane, which is lent to and exhibited in Dublin in 1944, had already been shown in an exhibition of works by artists of our allies, circulated by the British Council in 1941. So Ireland may have been neutral, but the loan of some of the very works that had been shown in propaganda exhibitions in Britain would no doubt have added to the atmosphere of the Dublin exhibition. The Czech and Polish work significantly changed the scope of the exhibition and gave it a character that was open to political interpretation. The 15 Czech and Polish loans meant the addition of a body of more recent work amounting to about 10% of the total. The inclusion of works by Gottlieb, along with others like Kosowski and Potworowski and other Poles, helped to give a better representation of modern Polish painting. And they put into a wider context the works by Polish painters of the School of Paris, such as Moshe Kisling and Zygmunt Menkes, that were loaned from within Ireland. And I might break away at this moment just to add a note about Ernie O'Malley, because as well as his support of Yeats, which is very important, he and Helen Hooker were very considerable collectors of works that they obtained in Paris in the 1920s and 1930s, and indeed they were both very significant lenders, but anonymously, to this particular event. Unfortunately, for want of installation photographs or detailed descriptions, it is hard now to identify many of the Czech and Polish loans. The wartime setting of this exhibition makes it totally different to the preceding three. Indeed, you can go a bit further and say that this loan exhibition in 1944 coincided exactly with the ill-fated Warsaw Uprising. In addition to being an unquestionably innovatory exhibition, it was also a distinct statement about artistic freedom, given the number of works by artists whose countries were still under occupation, or artists who had been stigmatized as entartata or degenerate by Nazi ideology. Indeed, among the works in the exhibition was one by the Hungarian painter Bela Kadar, who was then immured in the Budapest ghetto, which he fortunately survived, and another was supplied, well, not by, but on behalf of the Czech painter Emil Fila, who spent the war in the Nazi concentration camps at Dachau and Buchenwald, which also he fortunately survived. So to sum up, the Polish Second Republic sought to compensate for decades of subjugation by affirmative action based on its own aesthetic resources. This was made manifest in the national character of the work, especially prints and kilims, that essentialized Polish aspirations and nationalism in the international arena. A more general combination of work was found in the Block exhibition, in which the paintings were in the mainstream of European modernist painting styles. Polish modernist painting, especially as it was represented in the School of Paris, was set alongside other aspects of European painting in the FNCI exhibition. In 1944, it was as important as ever for Poland to keep self-determination in all its forms in the foreground. In the context of the FNCI exhibition, modern art was instrumentalized as an expression of cultural freedom and a statement of vitality in an era of continuing struggle for control and struggle against oppression. Thus, we have the internationalization of culture in complementary ways. First, as the self-determination of a state in its own right in the 1930s, and secondly, collective action as part of a wider pursuit of a return to those earlier freedoms in the 1940s. There we go, 49 seconds left. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Gabby and Philip, and great timing there. So in a change to our advertised schedule, unfortunately due to illness, we don't have a paper by Ivan Aiken, so we're going to move directly on to our next paper, which is Brazil and Ireland in 1922, Culture and Identity in a Comparative Context. And we're honoured to welcome the Brazilian ambassador to Ireland to give this paper, who is Marcel Biato. And His Excellency has been ambassador to Ireland since December 2020. He joined the Brazilian Foreign Service in 1980 and served in London from 1987 to 1990 and in Berlin from 1990 to 1994. He acted as legal advisor at the United Nations from 1999 to 2003. In the Foreign Ministry, he has covered Latin American and military issues with an emphasis on regional integration and peace processes. From 2003 to 2010, he was assistant to President of Brazil's Chief Foreign Policy Advisor, covering both global and regional affairs. From 2010 to 2013, he was ambassador to Bolivia, focusing on anti-narcotics cooperation, energy integration, and broader security issues. From 2016 to 2020, he was permanent representative to the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. And since December 2020, he has been ambassador to Ireland. Ambassador Biato holds a master's degree in political sociology from the London School of Economics and has published articles on Latin American politics, Brazilian foreign policy, global governance, the International Criminal Court, and the law of the sea. Welcome, Your Excellency.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. As you can all see, I am profoundly knowledgeable about arts and things, which allows me then the liberty to express myself on issues of which I have little academic knowledge, but a lot of personal enthusiasm. But let me begin by thanking the organizer of this event. It's a pleasure to be here. And I have to be especially thankful to Professor Kennedy, who, although she did not quite steal my thunder, I think you will see some echoes of what I have to say in her comments. The whole issue, and again, the issue of Poland here. Ireland and Poland, roughly 100 years old. Brazil, 200 years old. The difference being that we have 100 years more time to consider the benefits and downsides of independence. So, yes, let me get my bearings here. So this is where we start. Okay. So I would like to really begin by saying that 1922 was an important year, not just for Ireland. Brazil as well was celebrating its 100th year of independence. And both countries decided to organize what became seminal exhibitions on art, art being an expression of culture, of identity. So far, so good, a very curious historical coincidence. But it goes beyond that, and you will see quite shortly. But I would just like to lay out very briefly what I hope to achieve to some extent, which is to argue that although the exhibitions were very far apart geographically, culturally, they are revealing a very common or very interesting commonalities and contrasts, parallels which I think are worth describing for the information and some conclusions we might allow ourselves to come to. The first point I would like to suggest as in a general conclusion is that they provide a unique cultural expression and provoke debate on national identity and national culture. The question is, why that time? Both countries, why would they celebrate independence? I would argue that because both were going through moments of profound political crisis, and that makes the role of art and the role of artists particularly relevant. Which suggests to me that the artistic imagination in breaking molds, in changing the way we traditionally look at things, and we have covered this in the previous presentations, has a central role in decolonization or self-determination, as we wish. And the common thread of independence obviously looked at different angles. In the case of the Paris exhibition, it invoked a national culture in the midst of a struggle for self-determination. So the enthusiasm of what independence could bring. In the case of Brazil, questioning the achievements or the downsides of 100 years of independence. And my final sort of bottom line conclusion is that I think we can affirm that this, to many, in a sense, explore the transformative power of art and artists in nation building, the creativity in responding to the challenges of national identity and how it's formed. So, January of 22, February of 1922, events with very interesting commonalities. The fundamental point here being that, as I would argue, just lost my paper here. The fundamental issue here being that the Brazilian event was fundamentally organized by artists who were demanding change and wanted to provoke in a very modernist sense. In the case of Ireland, we have very clearly an exhibition that was organized, as was presented by Dr. Kennedy, from a very official perspective. Now, I would like to emphasize the contrast between art used as an instrument to promote culture and what was the traditional reality of, let's say, 19th century, early 20th century international exhibitions, which were really an exercise in what I would call the power of elites through science, through technology, to generate the technological benefits that would inform and generate improvement for society as a whole. But clearly, science, technology, and elites running the exercise. Now, you have here, in the case of Ireland, an example of the 1865 exhibition, Arts and Manufactures, which talks about the idea of how Ireland could become an industrialized country. In the case of Brazil, we have a mock example of the Brazilian then emperor, Dom Pedro II, being the second person to take part in a telephone conversation in human history. That's Graham Bell speaking with him at the 1876 exhibition in Chicago. He was the curator of the selection process, and he got an opportunity. And it just goes to the point that he had this vision of Brazil importing technology, science, to transform society. So Brazil had the second telephone line in history, and also illuminated the lampposts with gas in Rio de Janeiro, second country as well. So science, technology, through elites transforming reality. Now, there's a hidden legacy to this experience. So it's all very clearly there. No? Brazil was a backward country, mixed race heritage. There was a policy of whitening Brazil through introduction of European immigration, which would do away with, well, then considered by that time anachronistic slavery. In Ireland, you had the reality of Catholic impoverishment, disenfranchisement, the whole reality of a religious, racial apartheid, I think we can also say, and we can maybe even compare it to some extent, I wonder, to Brazilian slavery. Now, in 1922, as I said, both countries were in the grips of what I describe as the failure of politics. In what is now the famous Copacabana Beach was the point of an uprising, just as central Dublin was as well, very, very much the same time. So what had independence actually brought to our countries? The contrast between the scientific, elitist vision of the future and the reality was quite stark. Ireland was going through its third home rule crisis, and Brazil was in the grips of socio-economic conflict and military intervention. So what's the way forward? Who would lead a change? Who would provide the impetus for rethinking how we are going to organize society that is not, well, obviously top-down? And the inspiration, not surprisingly, comes from Europe, where industrialization, chronic, chaotic urbanization had led to war, destruction, and, well, Spengler's vision of the decadent West. At the same time, this profound artistic ferment, the search for solutions that went beyond appearances, that went, and how individuals and nations self-destructed. Obviously, psychoanalysis, the underlying drives in society. How could you bring this to the fore? And that meant that art had, again, to go beyond the surface. And modernism rejected representational rationalistic language. It focused on the fundamentals. It rejected inherited wisdom, authority. And this struck a chord in Brazil, in Ireland. But I think, in many ways, more profound than we might expect. You see, I would argue, at least it seems to me, that the notion of modernism is to say that we are the victims of our own success. The Enlightenment has brought technological change, transformation, but at the same time, one of the obvious consequences is war, destruction. And this has led in Europe, certainly to, beginning of the 20th century, a sense of collapse, disorientation. How is this received in countries like Brazil and Ireland? What I would argue is that the modernist sensibility says that, well, this is the existential reality of a colonized country, that we were transformed, we were invaded, suffered violence, but something came out of all this, which are new nations, a recreation of phenomena there, but we can afford to be more optimistic. We can afford to think about what is the way to realize that this reality, no matter how traumatic, is also the birth of something new. So, 1922, you see they're all dressed not too differently, although it's slightly colder. It's summer in Brazil. So, modernism is a force that is there. What I would argue is that they were used very differently in both countries. In the case of Ireland, I don't need to go into details. Professor Kennedy has made some references, and I'm sure you're all fully aware. It was a government organized exercise. It was a branding exercise. It wished to mobilize the Irish diaspora to promote, as she well suggested, a forward-looking, independent, self-sufficient country. And it was well received. The objective of the Irish Race Congress, which was precisely to mobilize this population, generated, at least in the short term, results. In the case of Brazil, it was promoted by restless artists. They were aristocratic, but they were still restless, and they wanted to provoke debate, and modernism was the way to provoke it. Art was a guerrilla war against the establishment. It was not well received. it was meant to, for a week, it lasted 3 days, because it was jeered and it was enormous uproar. And they almost chased out of the halls. In a way, a contrast or comparable to John Synge, the greatest playboy in the West, the difference being that in Brazil, this had not to do with moral issues which, let's say, generated, let's say, reaction in public opinion. It was much more an academic, let's say, theoretical exercise, but it was rejected. But there is also the political component, because the governor of São Paulo state, which wanted to rivalize with Rio, São Paulo was a rising state, the economic powerhouse, and it wanted to take leadership in Brazil. It said, well, this is a good opportunity. So just as in Ireland, the political component was there, and it was used as an opportunity to promote São Paulo as the new capital, or at least the cultural capital, economic force of the country. And it was totally successful in that sense. Now, what is the branding about? In the case of Ireland, struggle for independence, questioning prejudices about Catholic peasants, slothlessness, inheritance of a proud civilization, let's say, freeing itself from the imperial yoke, recovery of a mythical past. I talk about a possible Irish empire through the diaspora. In the case, and there are interesting links to Brazil, which I don't have time to go into detail, but Roger Casement talked about the High Brazil. Many of you may have heard of it, this fictional Irish island where, well, honey and milk. And he wrote a piece, which is in the National Library, the original, about the origin of the name Brazil, the country, which he attributes to this, through these connections, these mythical, let's say, missionary, mercenary, historical connections of Ireland across the Atlantic. Liam O'Flaherty was 2 years in Brazil and Argentina. In his 2 years, this book, he talks about his experience, and he went there because he saw no future in Ireland until he heard about the revolution, and he went quickly back. Brazil, branding. It's about a modernist future. That's one of the few non-1922 illustrations you'll see here. Industrialization as a way to self-sufficiency. Redefining Brazilianness. Are we aristocratic Europeans? Are we multi-ethnic urban industrial proletariat? Are we slum dwellers? Are we rural peasantry? A mixture, ethnic, with industry in the background. Now, modernism, as I said, is about debunking, deconstructing, challenging. And it uses all methods and all styles. So here you can see quite a few. You have Mary Sweeney, and you also have some Brazilians, and you also have, I think it's Grace Henry there, I think, which also appeared just previously. So everything that can challenge prevailing conceptions through different themes and different forms. So, new landscapes, west of Ireland, the Aryan Islands, the folk heroes of, in the case of Brazil, the hinterland, new women who can be proud of who they are on their own, no men, not working, or socially conditioned or restrained, but just enjoying their lifestyle, whatever that is. Workers, free of slavery or serfdom. Work is liberating, it's enabling, it's ennobling, even if it is potentially harsh and demanding. They are working for themselves, they're doing manual, but not necessarily menial work. They produce goods that have a value beyond class barriers and values, and anything to do with slave mentality. Or taboos. So, shanty towns in Brazil, prostitution in Brazil, and what maybe a slightly different interpretation from Professor Kennedy, political unrest, or what is behind the apparent, let's say, calmness, which is the military component, the violence that is behind this apparently idyllic scene. Religion. Is there not an emancipatory role, as I call it, for religion within the realm of emotions as a force for change and transcendence? So understanding human emotions within the search for transcendence, that is the role of religion. New actors, again, Mani, that's what it's called? Mani Gillette and Anita Malfatti in Brazil. These two ladies were fighting for space. Women were pioneers. In 1917, Anita Malfatti was the first Brazilian to have a modernist exhibition. And she was totally rejected, totally rejected. She was called, I forget, paranoid, yes. She was described as paranoid, whereas Mani Gillette, she was described as her painting as an insoluble puzzle, and George Russell called her artistic malaria. Yeah? So, so what's the synthesis of this? No? National pride, self-reliance, self-confidence. Time is running out, so I'll be quick. Now, klaxon is not an Irish invention. It's probably French, but in a year before, a Brazilian magazine called Klaxon, with a very, very modernist presentation. It also, like the Irish, generated thinking and challenges outside of art and questioning. And obviously, Professor Kennedy's references are very interesting. I won't have time to go into it. Just to conclude, a new national perspective. In the case of Brazil, Brazil is no, sorry, too early. It's not a tropicalized Europe. Is it just a mishmash? No, it's a synthesis. And the question is, of what? The answer comes through cultural cannibalism, which is recognizing that it is by adopting the other's merits and qualities that we become emboldened and strengthened. That is the concept which historically has been used in Brazilian modernist thinking. What does this mean? This means that the Brazilian story is one of someone who has to be changed and the fusion of cultures and history. In the case of Ireland, I would argue it has to do with not a unifying force to forge a new paradigm, but rather to reaffirm a mythical legacy, which has to do with, as was explained, the role of the state. So I would argue that partition in the case of Ireland had a very important impact in generating restrictions to how you were willing to consider your national identity. Looking forward, I think we have to think about the collapse of British ascendancy, the centrality of the European Union, and the mega digital enterprises as things to consider as we think about what is Irish identity. In the case of Brazil, equally shedding what are statism and questioning identity. And just finally, the question of the role of the diaspora. I think diaspora is crucial today to the way we think about the future. In many ways, we can argue that identity is formed almost in a global environment. And to put an end to that, I would just like to say that the role of the artist maybe today is now again in question. What can the artist provide? And this is a mural which was inaugurated just last Tuesday, celebrating Brazilian independence and Irish integration, and maybe that is an inspiration for us for the future. Thank you very much. It's a bit rushed.
Perfect.
Okay.
No, so take your time. We
Yes.
have plenty of time for questions.
Okay.
I guess just between Roisin Kennedy's paper this morning and the two papers, there are a lot of things that have been thrown up in terms of official art, unofficial art in terms of what was commissioned, or maybe what you decided was a way of rethinking and deconstructing, in fact, what was possible about old identities in the new state? I think it's very interesting, Ambassador, because you were saying it's 100 years older, and yet the concerns seem to be quite circular, and that we seem to be coming back to certain notions. Have we got any questions from the floor or online to begin with? Oh, this, I see.
For Ambassador Biato, apologies. I'm curious, one of the differences between Brazil and Ireland...
Sorry, can I see? Oh, yeah.
Okay. One of the differences in Brazil and Ireland is because in the Irish art that was formed at the beginning of the state, there was a big interest in our ancient indigenous culture. For example, Thomas Kinsella's translation of the Tombo Kilnia, illustrated by Louis Le Brocchi. But in Brazil, there is a real existing indigenous population. So I'm curious as to what extent was there a dialogue there, and perhaps what would be the Brazilian equivalent of the Tombo Kilnia or the cattle raid of Cooley, like a definitive, ancient text that's kind of referred to, so to speak.
Well, thank you for that. Well, I would say there really isn't such. Indigenous populations in Brazil were not literate, so everything that exists was basically written down or by foreign missionaries or conquistadores with their own perception. It was never presented as a mythical past to be relived. It was rather presented either as a primitive, let's say, avatar of Ur-Brazilianness, which didn't really mean very much. And that is why we were left 100 years after independence still asking ourselves what Brazilian identity is. And the fusion, which I really didn't have time to go into detail because it's very too compressed, is the idea that you have an original population which is closed off and that needs to eat meat, human meat, being a cannibal, and actually absorbing the qualities of the foreigner, and through that process of fusion, generating a new identity. And my suggestion or my provocation is that this is a very different process from what happened in Ireland. And ultimately, it was a reaffirmation of traditional beliefs, sense of identity, racial as well as cultural, that I think, my opinion, met a challenge when partition came and the sense of a national identity could not fully develop. So I think they took different directions. But fundamentally, there is no fundamental, let's say, original indigenous model or vision that has then been replicated. No.
Can I ask to sort of add to that, though? Did the Portuguese imaginary become imported into the Brazilian in a similar way?
In a very limited sense, because this is a very, very long discussion, but I would just say that the Portuguese were very influential in generating the notion of Brazil as a new dispensation of world history. Because just as the British did in North America, the Portuguese said, we are taking civilization through our culture and religion, and we are founding a new modern society. In the case of Brazil, this involved the indigenous populations. In the case of the Americas,
and Gabby, how would you answer that question in terms of Polish culture, in terms of these grand narratives or epic stories? Would you say that they're also transposed?
Poland is a bit curious in that regard because it wasn't on the map for a solid while. And, for a country that does not technically exist on a map, creating that identity anew after it's finally kind of established again. They did certainly look back into the past, like you've seen it with the Gural. It's this traditional kind of tendencies that we see. And of course, you had different kind of aspects of it and different people thinking different things about how it should be represented. But generally, there is always that looking back and trying to kind of take that and make something new out of it to create this new idea of Polishness.
Philip?
I'm very reluctant to speak at any great length on Polish history or the idea of how cultural identity reforms in the period after 1922. And it's in formation long before that, though, isn't it, with the Young Poland movement, if not even earlier. So the cultural, or the sense of cultural cohesion precedes the establishment of a coherent state.
I don't think Polish identity ever stopped existing, even though country on the map stopped existing at a certain point. So kind of this thing that Polish people were, if you told someone that, because today is the 104th anniversary of Polish independence, if you told someone, oh, so this is when Poland became a country, if you say that to a Polish person, they might be slightly offended, because the Polish mentality did not stop existing 104 years before that. It continued even throughout that time, and I think that should be remembered.
Okay. Stephen, we have a question at the front here with Lisa. Luke, yeah.
Hi, thanks for your papers. I have a question just about the reception of the textiles in Ireland, and whether there was much discourse in Poland at the time about kind of equivalencies between different kind of art practices, like whether fine art was seen as distinct from textile art and so on. So I'm just thinking of the arts and crafts movement in Ireland as an interesting parallel.
Yeah, there was a very considerable arts and crafts movement in Poland from the late 19th century onwards, in which many pre-existing traditions were kind of renovated and coordinated. And as Gabriela was just saying, we mustn't talk about them never being a Polish country, because in the mentality that continues, even if there isn't a defined state on the map. But taking the idea of Poland as that sort of cultural construct, a very important part of it was a turning inwards and a turning to the south, to the Tatras, and that feeds into particular styles of architecture being revived and favoured and promoted as distinctive national styles, but also of decorative arts and so on that go into these styles of architecture, particularly the wooden-built sort of chalet-type houses, if that's not to understate their interest, but also to revive and expand and promote the textile weaving, either as a kind of artisanal activity or as something which is potentially industrial as well. That is part of an industrial expansion that the new state is very eager to be part of. The sense of awareness that there was of these things going on in Poland as having correspondences to what was going on elsewhere is quite strong, but it's especially strong in relation to France and Paris in particular, and the idea of art and craft type activity as it's taking off there. Because for historic reasons, the cultural connections between Poland and France were perhaps the strongest that there were looking westwards from Poland. There was some connection with England, and there's a book that's appeared recently exploring the arts and crafts connections between England and Poland. Don't ask me the name of the author because I can't remember. So that, I think, is a ripe area for future more detailed consideration to see exactly how. Well, it goes back to William Morris. I think that's the sort of peg that it hangs on, and then how that follows through the 80s and 90s and into the 1920s. The
so
fundamental
we have,
thing.
with some more questions,
okay.
maybe.
Sorry, sure.
Lisa, you might pick up with Philip. So,
And
Roisin and Luke as well.
Yes, yeah, he gets started and then
we get started at the end.
Hi. I've got two sort of questions, if I can formulate them. First of all, to say how much I enjoyed both of the presentations, and it's just amazing to have these connections opening up and these parallels opening up between Brazil and Ireland and Poland and Ireland. One question is a very specific thing about what was the response? Have you a sense of what the response was in Irish circles to the Polish exhibitions, and what were the networks that Dobrzyński had, who were his contacts in an Irish context? And then another, just now that I'm up here and it's a bit of a palaver to ask a question, just generally the Brazilian, I'm totally ignorant about Brazil, but I wondered, was a difference the fact that this avant-garde movement that was taking off in Brazil 100 years in, it's really critiquing something that has been in existence for 100 years. Whereas in Ireland, they're faced with, something that's new, something that's beginning, and that they're involved in a way in establishing. You might have something to say about that.
Please begin.
I should try to be more succinct this time. As far as Dobrzyński is concerned, he seems to have had a lot of connections. That is, he knew a lot of people, and that was part of his job. How personally friendly he was with particular individuals, it's a bit more difficult to tease out. But starting at the top, one of the people who he did think was a friend of his was Douglas Hyde. And he maintained that friendship by making various diplomatic gifts. And at the height of the Second World War, he was sending him Polish propaganda material, which was a little bit controversial. But he was also sending him things like the Teutonic Knights by Sienkiewicz, which is an extremely important item of Polish national literature by what turned out to be a Nobel Prize-winning author. But it takes an historical view. So it's a bit like Walter Scott, sort of, historical novel. So I don't necessarily have I can make a list of the people that I know he was in contact with, but Douglas Hyde is someone with whom I can say he thought he was friendly rather than just acquainted for diplomatic or social purposes.
Well, in the case of Brazil, what I would argue, as I suggested, and I think you've taken on, is that it was a much more radical questioning exercise, and therefore modernism took a much stronger hold, and it influenced architecture, well, the capital, Brasilia, whole thinking in sociology, economics, about what the country was about, because there was a fundamental skepticism. 100 years of independence, and what did we have to show for it? So although there was a superficial elite and progress as the emperor was able to showcase, the fundamentals were there, the problems were there. We're just out of slavery. As in the US, the issues of how to do with the post-slavery society were very much center and forward. And so it was a much more, I would argue, questioning, provocative exercise, because there was a sense that, it was just not romantic optimism. It was a sense that we had to shake up society dramatically if things were to change. And that's what it was about.
It feels to me that there are a lot of parallels to be made with Ankara.
Sorry?
The building of Ankara in Turkey, in terms of really dispensing with the Ottoman history, starting anew, starting secular, starting afresh.
So just to say that Brazil has 10 regional capitals which are built from scratch.
Wow. Luke, you had something to... sorry. I didn't see.
Hi, thank you for amazing presentations, really interesting connections, and triggers all kinds of associations. So the question is for actually all four people, Gabriela, Philip, Marcel, and Seán. I'm interested to see whether there are parallels that can be drawn from the connection of the artists in each of the countries or cultural milieu and the Catholic Church, because obviously we're talking about 4 Catholic states. And I'm interested in obviously it's a big question, so in a historic overview of the influence of the Catholic Church on the artist, and the contemporary, where it might be presented as sort of an anti-movement, if you like. I don't know enough about Brazil, but sort of have some idea about Poland and Ireland. And so it's interesting for me to see what happens with traditional art, indigenous art, and contemporary art when it is faced with a Catholic state, effectively.
Mm-hmm. Please begin. I have to think about this. Yeah. Get somebody else to talk first.
I think both Poland and Ireland, especially culturally, I suppose, are seen as very, very Catholic. Not now as much as beforehand. At the time, Poland was very religious. I think Ireland was fairly religious at the time, too, from what I know. And I think it does reflect in art in Poland. And you can see it even in the flight from Egypt. It's present. It's not always present, I think. It's not dominating every art piece, but it's there.
My sense of it is that religious subject matter is very frequently encountered, whether it's in more traditional or in more modern style. So it's an integral part of Polish artistic output across the board. But as far as the ambitions of the nation are concerned, they are very strongly secular in the period, aren't they? I mean, there are religiously inspired political parties in the period of not just Christian religion either, but there's a very strong Jewish political movement in Poland in the period as well. But I'm getting off the point again. The point is, I don't think there is the type of, or I don't get the sense of, if you correct me on this, that there is the same degree of Catholic Church influence on day-to-day political conduct of the sort that you might think of in connection to Ireland in the period. Or have I not understood it properly?
I don't think...
You don't agree?
No. I think I agree. I think in artistic terms of kind of politics and how Poland was represented, it definitely doesn't reflect as much. I think in kind of the cultural sense of what people wanted the politics to be like, it was definitely fairly religious.
Okay.
And Brazil?
Yeah, well, the Brazilian Republic, going back to what I said before, the Brazilian Republic, which was proclaimed 30 years before this exhibition, was a civil religion. Put it this way, it was a military coup by technocratic, scientifically minded bureaucrats who believed in Comteanism, sociology, positivism, which is emblazoned on our flag. Order and progress. We just left out the love. No? So it's the idea that it's science, it's a civil religion philosophy that is through technology and government, state-led organizing of society that you will achieve change. The Catholic Church was de-established in Brazil with the Republic and has had an important moral, ethical influence in Brazil up to the 1960s.
Okay, and to briefly answer your question, Barbara, after Catholic emancipation in 1829 and right through to Vatican II, the Church was the largest patron of any kind of cultural production in Ireland. So religious art dominated cultural production. But what is interesting is the tension between Anglo-Irish Protestant artists like Jellett and Hone and others who were deeply religious. I mean, Evie Hone toyed with becoming a nun. And in fact, Albert Glaise, who was their important teacher, did in fact convert to Roman Catholicism, I believe. So there is a tension, and in fact, what Jellett did was to combine the two things, modernist style with religious figuration, and what Rianne Coulter is that this was her way of making modernism palatable to the wider populace, in effect. We've barely time for one more, and then we'll take a quick break, a very 1 minute break before Lisa starts.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
It's just picking up on, indeed, Catholic modernism, and it brings up the issue that a lot of the papers have in common, and that is of modernism emerging in the margins as against the more outdated model that modernism came to the periphery from the metropolitan centre. And that idea that modernism was an import into Ireland, or an import into Brazil, or an import into Poland. And ironically, one of the figures linking the three papers this morning is Joseph Conrad, the Polish novelist whose experimental narrative forms brought him in contact with Casement, and Casement, meanwhile, in contact with the Putumayo. And the notion that modernism emerges as much from within, and it's very striking, as Seán was saying, that according as Mamie Jellett began to evolve modernist forms, she began to paint Madonnas and began to gravitate towards aspects of European Catholicism. And that was part of Thomas McGreevy's argument, that what Catholicism meant was not Roman Catholicism, but European Catholicism. So the idea that modernism comes from within emergent forms, of course, there is an international aspect to it, and people say international modernism, but the tendency to see modernism as coming in from the outside and being kind of alien or being foreign to indigenous forms. I think the papers this morning, in different ways, have managed to challenge that. And of course, Mexico being the most obvious case of an explosion of modernist creativity in a way that was in advance of European and metropolitan forms. So could you say something about that modernism comes in from the margins? It's not just coming in from the metropolitan centre, and whether it's Poland or Brazil or
And
Ireland.
we have 90 seconds, so make it snappy.
Yes. That's a snappy answer, isn't it? When we talk, I mean, especially now, this is an even more complicated subject than it ever was in the past, because we're thinking about multiple modernisms of all different sorts of origins, both chronologically and geographically, and across the whole kind of plethora of considerations. So, from having a kind of monolithic idea of what modernism was as being particular time, particular place, particular this, that, and the other, now we're thinking about multiple competing modernisms which are in tension with each other, as well as in tension with pre-existing artistic ideas and practices. So what you say, that's why I said yes, I agree with you. This is part of the opening up and the re-questioning of these things, and understanding better the sorts of connections that there were, and the sorts of influences and exchanges that there were, some of which are quite unsuspected, and mentioning Conrad is a good way of drawing those sort of things together.
No, just very brief.
Yeah, just brief to say, well, I agree, and just to say that fundamentally, in the art context, I think it is very clear that the foreign or European influence was decisive in giving shape to what we saw and what was described here. But obviously, in the case of Brazil and others, and I mentioned the undercurrent of positivism and the industrial transformations going on long before that, and which made this artistic expression possible. So, they go hand in hand, but I would agree with you in general, and we must take modernism not as a monolithic concept.
Okay, could I just ask for a round of applause to our wonderful panelists this morning?